both in this room and online. We have some people watching on 15 participants on Zoom. Thank you all for coming to the seminar, New Directions in Economic Sociology. We have a very packed program over these 2 days, and don't want to waste anyone's time, especially Ariel's time. So I'll be very, very quick. I would just like to say a few words about the seminar and acknowledge the enormous support we have received. The seminar began to take shape in September 2022 during a meeting we had at Princeton University. And it's pretty much the result of a provocation made by Fred Wary, who should not take the blame, of course, and has not even arrived to defend himself, so yeah. Yeah. Fred asked us to imagine what economic sociology should be doing and what deserves to be in a new handbook. Very, very bold. I took this idea very seriously. I took the idea seriously enough to start a conversation about the objects, the approaches, and the methods that the field must confront and develop, which have either been overlooked or remain on the fringes. And what could be more fitting than starting this conversation at the periphery? I sometimes think that periphery is better suited to induce some frictions in the field. So that's why we're doing this in São Paulo. I invited a group of scholars and asked them to think about how their research can push the boundaries of the field. Of course, no one needs to reinvent the wheel and neglect the enormous contributions of this dynamic field. But I invited them to be heretics and try to show new directions in economic sociology. Of course, this seminar does not claim to represent the diversity of all possible new paths for economic sociology. No today's seminar could. And I'm sure we need to include many other voices in this conversation from near and far. But sometimes there are very practical reasons underlying the outcome of projects. In this case, it is SASI's annual meeting being held in Rio that made it possible to gather the participants in this room to start this conversation. And hopefully we can continue and incorporate other voices. It's not like this is a pre-SASI event, it's more that SASI is a post-New Directions event, right? So we have 9 presentations and discussions scheduled over the course of these 2 days. We have allocated 1 hour for each presentation and discussion, and I will not impose any strict time limits on the presentations, but if you want, I can remind you when there are like 20 or 15 minutes left, whatever you want, to allow for some discussion. Zoom participants can also take part in the discussion. We'll bring your questions to the room. But please note that this is also being broadcasted on YouTube, and the YouTube broadcast is not being monitored, so if you want to participate, please join us via Zoom. I'd like to conclude with some acknowledgements. Firstly, I want to thank the 8 participants for coming to São Paulo, spending 2 days, this work, and especially before your engagements at SASI. There's some crazy travel arrangements involved in getting people here, so really, I'm really grateful. I'm also very grateful to the Department of Sociology and the postgraduate program in Sociology at the University of São Paulo for providing the resources for this seminar. And I would also like to express my gratitude to the audiovisual staff here. Thank you. And lastly, but certainly not least, I want to thank, where's Enrique? Enrique Hernandez, our intern in charge of events, the designer of our poster and great helper, and Thales Mansano, who is assisting with the event. So without further ado, Ariel. I just need to help you sharing this. I'm not even sure if I can, but how to do this? No. Mm-hmm. I think it should work.
Buon tarde. Thank you to André for the invitation to organize this amazing seminar to share this academic exchange with colleagues that I meet, with friends. Also, for me, it's an honor to be in this sociology department in the USP. I like the history, the social and political history of social science of Latin American, and the people that know this history of the social sciences in Latin America knows that this department of sociology is one of the most important departments of sociology of our field in our region. So for me, it's very important to be here, and also I want to say that and share that with you. I want to thank also to Marcin, because the piece, the paper, the text that I share with you was published in the Economic Sociology Perspective and Conversation, that was edited by Marcin and was published 1 week ago. So yes, it's fresh. So it's not definitely paper. This is something that I'm working now also. I try to, this is the first time, this is the first time that I put some ideas and some empirical material together, so this discussion for me will be very important. The sociology of money is a central chapter of the political and state sociology. This idea has guided my work for the last 15 years and clearly has inspiration in Max Weber. While we have inspiring manuals on Weberian economic sociology, less attention has been paid to the German sociology argument that contribute to support the thesis of the central role of the sociology of money for the analysis of politics and the state. For example, Max Weber types of domination are not only differentiated by the belief and that sustain them, or by the relationship by the authorities and the body of administration. They are also differentiated by the form of payment associated with them, in kind and irregular in charismatic domination, and fiat money and regular in legal rational domination. Another example, for Weber, democracy and money are intertwined with political life. The competition between political parties makes money a critical part of their activities. From this perspective, money helps rationalize political life, stabilizing the relationship between leaders and followers. My research has contributed also to develop this perspective. In my book on money in the life of the poor, I analyzed the uses and meaning of money in the patronage network of the political parties. In the book that I have written with my friend and colleague Mariana, where is Mariana? About the social and cultural history of the US dollar in Argentina, we analyze how the foreign exchange market in Argentina is an informal institution of democracy. The growth of extreme right-wing or libertarian political options in Argentina electoral landscape is a new context for developing this perspective.
I'm so sorry. Zoom is not passing the slide. I have to adjust here.
Okay. Yes, don't worry. It's okay. So, any question? Anyway, the presentation is not so good, so I don't know. So, the growth of extreme right-wing or libertarian political option in the Argentine electoral landscape is a new context for developing this perspective on the uses and meaning of money as a lens for analyzing democratic processes. These political options were fueled by a strong distance, criticism, or discomfort with respect to the state, both because of what was done during the COVID-19 pandemic and because of the increased inflation, which in Argentina case reached level close to the 100 annually in the last 2 years. Today, in my piece, I want to share with you how I use the sociology of money as a lens to understand this challenging situation for the democracy in Argentina. In her work on financial market, Marion Fourcade has pointed out the need for a moral sociology of the state that will focus on, I quote, the constant ebb and flow of state claims upon society and the society's claim upon the state. In my paper, taking an approach based on the sociology of money, I tell you to show how society made demands on the state both for relief measuring during the pandemic, but also blame the state for its contribution to the inflation. I also quote Viviana Zelitzer phrase. I finally understood the historical paradox that just as the US state worked to achieve a single national currency, people were continually disrupting monetary uniformity by creating all sorts of monetary distinction. Say Viviana. 2 decades after the social meaning of money was first published, this is the Zelitzer assessment of the one of most important discovery of her book. The paradox that Zelitzer notes rests in the discovery of people's enormous creativity when it comes time to use and giving meaning to money. This paradox captures an idea that represents the cornerstone in the sociology inspired by Zelitzer. The use and social meaning of money go beyond the norms, discourse, and memories established by the state. Sorry. Okay. Between 2020 and 2022, 2 major events shook society, the economy, and the daily life of people across the world. The COVID-19 pandemic was the first of these events and set off a new cycle of inflation after several decades in which price has been at virtual standstill for most countries worldwide. My work focused on economic relief for the household, people's daily response to the economic crisis, and finally, the social and political experience of inflation. Paradoxically, when the government intervened more activity at both social and economic levels, society focused on the state weakness and limitation and really more on impersonal ties that government relief to weather the crisis, pandemic, high inflation. In my presentation, set up to show how during time crisis, money creates a special insight into the frequent conflict between the state and the practices of actors who produce social and moral order. In the crisis analysis, this culminate here, this culminate in a sense of moral superiority over the state on the part of the society. The ideas and beliefs associated with these processes instill moral capital, convincing society that it was better able than the state to handle and resolve the urgent problems tied to the crisis. Social life involves taking or assigning credit and blame, as Charles Tilly has masterfully argued. Along with this blame, a society's sense of moral superiority over the Argentine state depends on refusing to give the state credit for the assistance it provided during the pandemic while blaming it for inflation.
Hmm.
I forgot that. Yes. It's okay, no? In Argentina, the government's slogan during the pandemic was El Estado te cuida, a state that protects you. The dimension include under this concept when beyond public health aspect to include the economic fallout from the COVID crisis. In this regard, the national government introduced a series of measures that include family income assistance, payroll relief for companies, supplementary food stamp loans at zero interest, and moratoriums on credit card payments, loans, and utility bills. Lockdown not only brought income in decline, but also an increase in the daily cost of complying with public health measures. For household economy, it was a perfect storm that rapidly led to increase in non-bank debt, late payment on taxes, utilities, internet and cell phone service, condo maintenance fee, rent, private school tuition, and private health insurance. The perfect storm described and the way in which it affects people's perception of government are particularly compelling. Political trends can be difficult to grasp without understanding that the social meaning of the social meaning of money exceeds norms, official discourse, and memories of the state. As in many other countries, elections were held during the pandemic, and the party in power suffered several losses to the public perception and how it handled the crisis. Among other factors, election choices depend on the economic relief government provides household. When the ruling party suffered significant losses in the primaries of the September 2021, sector close to the administration began demanding greater public expenditure to try to win voters back before the general elections. The belief was that expand economic relief would favor the ruling party at the ballot box. However, there were three factors that the administration did not consider. The first was that many households used the economic relief to pay off debts incurred during the lockdown. In other words, though money was coming into bank accounts, people had little time to form a lasting memory of it. Thus, when it comes to vote, the economic relief provided by the state did little to instill a positive perception of the administration. The first reality that this process unveiled then is that memory of cash transfer by the state does not always match the government expectation of how this transfer will be remembered. The second reality, the second dimension, the administration overlooked is that for many beneficiaries of COVID economic relief, accepting welfare impact negatively in their social identity. Between economic fallout, a job market increasingly characterized by informal and precarious work, income decline, and deteriorating living conditions in cities, receiving COVID relief shook shock lower middle class pride of not being on welfare. In the view of many well-heeled progressives, this money was a symbol of el Estado te cuida. For those receiving the money, por contrary, it was evidence of a social downturn. When lower middle classes received cash transfer, then there was no rejoicing, perhaps because relief money was immediately used to pay debts or because of the nagging feeling that it meant a step down the social ladder. Hence, the funds produced no warm memories that could lead to the public recognition of that money in the form of a vote for the party, for example. When predicting the positive effects the cash transfer could have on people's satisfaction with the government, the administration did not stop to consider the divergence between rituals and meaning of states in domestic life and the public sphere. The third reality is that the state money did not lead to show of support for the government. During the pandemic, having enough money to keep the household running was a challenge. For the families, and especially women, applying for the state aid was one but not the only solution. Monica was one of the women interviewed in our project on the pandemic and economic crisis. The state responsibility was largely tied to lockdown restrictions for her. Because the vast majority of short-required mobility, the lockdown severely limited the possibilities of this lower-income household, even considering the welfare provided at the start. In Monica's mind, this travel could not be addressed with a bag of food products provided by the government. Being unable to work mean, I quote her, being unable to work mean rationing out the items in the food package. But how far does get you? Not too far, sure. You can cook up some noodles, buy some eggs, but we didn't have money for meat or vegetables. Every day at noon, I would start worrying because I didn't know what we'd eat. I would say, well, my kids are older, they can drink mate, but that's not right. I'm used to serving everyone a plate of food, and I felt miserable and tried to tell myself, okay, this too will pass. Monica felt that her husband and children were all doing their best to get through this dire situation. Her husband, for example, sold many of the work tools he had accumulated over the years to ensure they could put food on the table. In families like Monica's, the joint effort to keep the household running and ensure the well-being of all members create a sense of moral superiority over the state. Far from consolidating an awareness of the critical support the state was providing, the cash transfer made families acutely aware of the effort and sacrifice they themselves were making to weather the economic and public health crisis. While the state expected it would get credit for a pandemic effort, people were far too preoccupied with paying down debts, surviving from paycheck to paycheck, and avoiding downward social mobility to sink state prices. Far from questioning the usefulness of cash transfer, this points to the fact that the cash distribution does not always bring gratitude. In this case, as in many others, society's reaction to policy can greatly diverge from policymakers' expectations. We can learn a very simple lesson that the sociology of money can contribute to sociology of the state. When the state transfers money to families, the money builds memories and rituals associated with its use that the state has not control over. The pandemic triggered inflation in countries around the world that had experienced price stability for decades. In 2022, the war in Ukraine drove inflation even higher. The case of Argentina was unique as the country had been suffering from spiraling inflation for over the decade. With the cessation of the decade of the currency war in 1991 to 2001, inflation had been a constant in Argentine society since the 50s. In certain periods, like the end of the 80s, it even spiralized into hyperinflation. After years of largely ineffective economic policies, the cycle of inflation that started in 2007 began picking up in 2021. Analysts has noted a large rise in the political option available to Argentine voters in recent years. In the analysis, however, little attention is given to the impact of the experience of high inflation. For example, the constant tightening of belts, growing household debt, and an inability to budget, a political tunnel vision focused exclusively on inflation and the impact of future outlooks, which are increasingly negative. In a society in which people did the impossible to get through the long months of lockdown while weathering inflation, the pandemic left people with the distinctive feeling that the state was coming up short. The pandemic and especially inflation are processes in which sacrifice become a common currency. Argentine society emerged from the pandemic with the ideology that was anti-state and anti-politics. High inflation combined with the pandemic negatively affects society's relation to politics. Society blamed the state inflation's rise. More people become convinced that the government spending was the primary source of inflation, demanding both moderate and, in some cases, extreme state cutbacks. The rise of right-leaning or extreme right option, the lack of interest in politics, and the growing dissatisfaction with the political class all predate the pandemic and the high inflation, though these have exacerbated excessive trends. At the time I was writing this presentation, the piece that was published in Perspective, and 6 months before, now it's 4 months before the presidential elections, the libertarian candidate Javier Milei has a vote intention of around 20-25%. He is the main promoter of the dollarization of the Argentine economy as a tool to fight the inflation, the high inflation. The neoliberal demands that after 2001 crisis in Argentina had been left almost without an audience are returning. Dollarization is inevitably accompanied by demands for the privatization of institutions such as education and healthcare. They celebrate individual initiative and denounce the crisis of public service as of their own making. The mood of society toward the performance of the state, increasingly questioned before the pandemic, is very favorable to right-wing libertarian privatizers. Si no me ayudas, por lo menos no me molestes. If you are not going to help me, at least don't bother me. The promise of dollarization suits these sentiments. The US dollar is a currency devoid of the arbitrariness of the Argentine state and the governmental elite that command it. A state that is perceived as guilty of disorganizing and worsening daily life through its inability to provide stability to the national peso. To conclude, the government officials often portray the state as a monolithic, especially when speaking on behalf of the society. During the global health crisis that accompanied the pandemic and the rearrangement it required, this state performance was a primary recourse to manage the emergency. Given its aim to analyze social practice, sociology is tasked with examining what is at work behind these state efforts. This presentation, and more broadly, the sociology of money, faced the challenge of showing how, during the crisis, money is a particularly apt lens for identifying the fierce conflict between the state goals and the practice of actors who shape the social and moral order. In the specific context of the pandemic and spiraling inflation in Argentina, the reconstruction of these processes revealed how it shaped a sense of moral superiority over the state and how it conditioned political expectation. The rise of the far right is rooted in this fierce conflict between society and the state, a conflict exacerbated by COVID-19 and rising inflation that could shake the very pillars of democratic rules. At such a conference, we will have a panel with Viviana Selicer, Fred Werry, and Neni Bendig on public Sociology of Money. The challenge, I believe, I expect, is to reinforce the contribution of the sociology that illuminates the importance of understanding how the uses and meaning of money contribute to strengthening or weakening democratic institutions. This is an old direction in economic sociology that I hope is renewed in the face to the current challenges of our society. Thanks. Excellent time, no?
Yeah.
Yes.
20 minutes.
So,
Questions. Do we have questions from? I need to ask people to use the microphone because
okay.
for questions because of the broadcasting. So if anyone wants to ask questions.
But do you have the mic?
I can walk around, but not too far because of the.
Okay, they can hear.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. So people watching. Yeah.
Thank you for the great presentation, really interesting. So Argentina is so often in these kinds of discussions about inflation sort of treated as this extreme case, unique case. And what's interesting about this, I think, is this you've in this situation, I think you've actually identified a process that's much more general in many ways, that we've, if this is the macroeconomic technocrats' lament around the world is precisely this process of they didn't give us any credit for all the stimulus, and now they're blaming us for the inflation. And you hear of different versions of this, and so I wonder if you want to reflect on that a little bit, and sort of how far this might travel. I know that obviously your sort of case analysis here is based in Argentina, and then I guess maybe where, to the extent that that's happened in more or less in many capitalist societies over the last 3 years, I wonder if the variation that's then of interest is then what is the sort of political response, right? Under what conditions does this sort of moral superiority end up going rightward or leftward or something like this? So it's a huge question.
Yes.
Maybe for reflections.
I answer now? Yeah. Thank you for your question. Yes, first, yes. I try to, my main objective was to try to put together sociology of money and sociology of the state. This is the first objective of my work. And the second, try to illuminate or try to show this articulation between sociology of money and sociology of the state. Try to show, illuminate, or as a tool to understand these political processes, the increase of the right wing, the libertarian ideas. I know it's not Argentina is not the unique case with inflation and with these political options. So in the first answer to you is this, I need the comparison. And the second part of the question was?
I guess I'm suggesting that you, I think this is part of what you're trying to do theoretically, is use this case to establish a more general kind of mechanism about a particular kind of role the sociology of money plays in helping us understand the articulation of state crises. What struck me in hearing it was that this is not just a story about Argentina at all. I mean, that's your case that you're focused on, obviously, but that it actually seems like this is something that can be generalized to some extent. I know people always want to be cautious about doing that, but I'm just curious, empirically, to what extent do you think this generalizes?
Yes,
It's an impossible question.
yes, it's impossible question, yes. But it's a good question that I would like to do that and to answer in the right way your question. But yes, we need a comparative frame. Maybe Marcin had something to say about that because he's working about inflation in Poland. So and also he works about economic sociology, sociology of money, etc. Marcin.
Sorry, go up there. So I was wondering, because you were talking about the moral superiority of people towards the state, but isn't the reaction of the state to have moral superiority towards the people? So how does the state respond, the people who create these policies, to this attitude that the society is not grateful? We do all this for them and they're not grateful, because you could imagine this would be sort of a neoliberal backlash. We will not, if they don't appreciate ours, we will not help.
Yes, it's very good question. Again, thank you, because he helped me to rework my perspective when he made a review. He's not responsible. I am responsible, but he helped me. This is a very good question, because in my perspective, the state is blind of that. This is my point. Also, this is the kind of sociology I try to do, a public sociology of money, because I think in how this material circulate and can to arrive to the public debate. And I think the problem is that the state is blind to this interpretation. It's blind, first, the role of money to produce this kind of political effects. This is the first. And this is my my work in the last 15 years was trying to discuss with this blindness of the state and the politics about the role of money, because as we know, also the state, the political has a neutral conception of money. It's very basic. They think the money is neutral in the political and the social and etc. This is and also they are blind for the second point, that the society or the different groups in the society during the pandemic produce this sense of superiority to the state. They expect the expectation of the state was so high of what they done during the pandemic, and they can understand what happened with the people, with the group that doesn't support the enormous effort that the state developed during the pandemic with the money that they put in the household economy. But the main, for me, point for this discussion about the economic sociology frame is try to show that the state is blind, the role of the money producing political expectation in a complex way. No, of course, maybe the political think that in the very basic way that only put money, it's enough. No, pay attention. It's not enough. The money produces other things in the social life, in the political life. And this is that I try to do in my work last year, precisely in this paper about what happened during the pandemic and what happened now during the context of high inflation.
I was wondering if you could say a few words about how the people in Argentina frame this COVID-19 related inflation, especially if I'm not wrong, Argentina had a high-ish rate of inflation in 2019, right? So how do they frame this first as something exceptional and something that was at the same time, that's what's really interesting about the case. It's on the one side single out that's related to the pandemic, but it's the state who gets the blame, right? So how do they frame this, specifically about inflation? The discourse, how they single out the state as the culprit for inflation amidst a pandemic.
To return to my argument, there are many ways to answer this your question, but the return of the dollarization option as a tool to battle the inflation is show two things. One, in the historical perspective, in the work that we done with Mariana, the book that we have written, we show the social and cultural history of dollarization, and this history is connected with the history of inflation in Argentina. So the reemerge of dollarization as political tool to combat the inflation is one of the frame. It's one of the frame. This historical frame, but also contextual frame, because the party or the leaders that offer these tools to combat inflation is a novelty for the political landscape, because people came from the far right, the libertarian ideas. So this is the connection with the COVID experience and inflation. The COVID experience produced or in a very deep way they criticize to the state. The state showed to the society the weakness in the moment that the state more intervene in the economy, in the society. The state show the weakness, and this weakness, this part of society traduce that they do more to navigate the crisis that the state is doing for them. And this produces distance and critical distance to the state, and this is the base for the increase these political options. That political options are offering this all new solution, the dollarization of the Argentine economy. So the frame is a mix between the historical process, the pandemic context, and the inflation context. And with these three aspects, we can understand why the dollarization that was a disaster in the past. We don't have with dollarization, we have a currency power system, but in the public discussion is all a mix. is returned as political option in the people that's offering is competitive in the next presidential election.
Thanks, Ariel. Interesting dynamics, and I was interested to hear a little bit more about nationalism. If also this means that nationalism is changing, because the state often features very problematic in ideas about nationalism. The far right is growing, and I don't know about Argentina, but often these are quite nationalist movements. At the same time, the state is losing legitimacy. So could you say something more? If nationalism ideology is changing, is this a kind of nationalism with a different state or without a state? Or I would be interesting to hear also if ideas about what Argentine nation ideology should be about now with this with this state that has lost its legitimacy. Yeah.
Thank you, Eric. One for person. No, okay.
Can
Yes, she can.
Yeah, maybe we can get the 3 questions and you.
But
Yes, please.
Sorry, I need my notes. Well, no, I was thinking it's very interesting, but my question is about collective claims, because Argentina has this quite interesting history linking economic crisis, financial expansion, and the raising of collective claims. We have together researched them, and to my knowledge, and the way you presented it, this specific type of deception with the state's policies during the pandemic has not really entailed collective claims up to now. At least not in the classic sense of people mobilizing in the streets, except for the very early demonstrations against lockdown or against the schools closing during 2020. We didn't see these classic collective claims. So my question is, do you think that this opens a new stage or a new momentum in this history of the relationship between money uses and relationships to the state, these links you want to explore?
I go for Eric's question.
Just one more question.
One. Okay. I had to.
No, this was very interesting, and I'm just thinking about Argentina as a case and how this might how your findings might compare and travel, and it strikes me that in contexts that don't have as recent experiences of high inflation, that have experienced inflation now over the last 3 years, particularly in Western Europe and the U.S., there's an alternate kind of moral claim that's emerged around inflation that's not on the state, but is about corporations, which sometimes gets referred to as greedflation or sellers inflation, but that they're corporate markups, and that's what's driving inflation. Is that something that's conceivable? Is that kind of moral claim conceivable in a context like Argentina, where the role of the state in prior inflationary episodes is so well established as a narrative, and it's all quite recent, whereas in contexts that have had longer periods of low inflation, that might enable a greater multiplicity of moral claims about the blame for inflation?
Well, maybe the first and the last question, maybe I try to put together for every question the nationalism problem issue is not present in the public debate, or at least not in the sense that in the Europe. I don't know what do you think, Mariana, but no, it's not divide the society. It's not divide the political party. It's not divide the political offer. It's the state. It's the state. It's an evaluation to the state. It's more what happened or what the state do, what must do the state, what didn't do in the past is the political issue that divide the society, and this is the reason why the moral evaluation is to the state. And the other part of the answer is where why the blame is going to the state and not to the corporations. And this is the reason. In the public conversation, the public debate, the state is the responsible from the increase of the inflation, and also in the corporation is also present, but in this moment, the responsibility of the corporation is present, but in this moment is less legitimate, this blame to the corporation. It's part of the political conversation, the political conflict, but the state responsibility is more and more in the center for right and for win options. So the national question is not present, the corporation question is the state. And this is also because, this is the reason also because I'm interested in illuminate this relationship between state society through the money. And your question, Mariana, I don't know. So what do you think about your question? I don't know. No, what kind of collective?
Because I think that's the very interesting thing about inflation. That even when you have this moral blaming thing, it's very difficult to say, well, this is our problem, this or that is to blame specifically. So we have this guilty organization, entity, etc. So we can build a claim, a specific claim, and demand that someone, the state or whatever, do something in order to solve the problem.
Yes, it's interesting. I try to.
And that makes that specific issue different from other economic issues that have other outcomes.
I was thinking that the inflation, the history of inflation in Argentina is very important. We have a period of hyperinflation, like Brazil. On one hand, on the other hand, we have a political culture of mobilization very strong also, but paradoxically, there are not events in the past that the public mobilization with the inflation in the agenda, or inflation, blame the state or blame the corporation around the mobilization around the inflation. There are different kinds of mobilization, but not with the inflation and the reason is not that inflation is a social, and political, and cultural, and economic processes that avoid mobilization. In Africa, there are many experiences of collective mobilization with inflation as central demand. This is not it's not the inflation per se, or the political, social, political configuration of inflation per se that avoid the collective mobilization. So we have to think about that.
So it's really fascinating to see a sociology of inflation, because it's something that we haven't done a lot of, and so just this was very thought-provoking. You focus quite a bit on the middle class, right? And so part of your argument was that the middle class gets COVID relief money, and then it gets coded as social welfare, and so that sort of transgresses this moral boundary. That to me is sort of interesting, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. It's sort of like, there was this moment like during the COVID pandemic where kind of it seemed that the response of the state globally could be construed as universal basic income, and so an expansion of rights, and what you're telling is a story that's very different. And so the question really has to do with a couple of things there. Is it like, once we look at like middle class experience of money, do we need to rethink some of the stories that we tell when we concentrate on other social classes? The other story is that, like, I mean, traditionally, I think, like, especially when economists like kind of think about inflation, what they really look at is wages, and so workers, and like, and so that's also a story that hasn't quite emerged in your research. And I'm sort of wondering, what the working class what role it plays in this debate about inflationary blame.
Very, very good question also. Because it's not so easy to answer, because this differentiation between working class and middle class is not evident. It's not evident. So it depends on the middle class, the informal middle class. They suffer the inflation in the same way that the lower classes, the informal sectors, they have more connection between the middle class with informal jobs, informal incomes, that is a big part of the middle class in Argentina, and also I imagine in Brazil. And what kind of working class we're talking about? The formal working class, they have, in the context of COVID, but also in the context of inflation, this word I use here, I didn't use in Argentina. They're kind of privileged class, because they are protected by the trade unions, the bargains salaries in the context of inflation. So it's in the COVID context, but more large in the inflation context, the hierarchies between social class but changing. The middle class with informal incomes, than in the worse situation, that in the working class that have rights, social protection, trade unions. So
many thanks. Have a small break for 10 minutes. We can do 10 minutes and then resume our assignment. Thank you.
You're welcome. Obrigado.
If some of the ideas that I'm discussing today sound sort of like familiar, and I hope I did enough, like, I reacted sufficiently well to the many comments that she gave me back then, because it was super useful. So I'm gonna try and contain this to about half an hour. This is work that tries to combine a sociology of exceptions with ongoing debates in economic sociology. I might be a little bit too abstract, so forgive me for that, but I'll try my best to kind of make it as concrete as possible. So sort of like the main motivation behind this paper is the classic economy-society boundary and the problem of governance that boundary poses. the idea that the economy gets depoliticized and made economic through processes of performativity and economization has really taken root in economic sociology due to the work of people that you're familiar with, Michel Calon, Don McKenzie, and so on and so forth. But to me, what's sort of interesting in kind of thinking about this literature is the sort of challenges that other traditions within economic sociology may pose to it. And so today I'm going to focus on a couple of issues. The fiction of market autonomy, a fiction that is important to sustain if you want to make an argument that the economy is its own autonomous domain from society and politics. What happens when that boundary breaks down such that it is impossible for the state to actually sustain it, because it has to make explicit interventions into the economy, make its own involvement in the economy visible. So that's the first problem. And the second problem is the technical aspect of markets. The fact that we now know that the technical infrastructure of market economies is important. It's difficult to understand it because it's full of details and kind of technicalities, full of routine procedures that seemingly work autonomously, except that when they do break down, they do call for political intervention. And so how is it that the technical infrastructure gets reestablished in the wake of visible presence of the government in the economy? So yeah, I'm glad to come after Ariel, because that was a very interesting way of kind of thinking about what happens when things break down and the sort of possibilities that open up. So these are sort of like, kind of really simple examples. You might have a financial crisis and the government gives out unemployment benefits or business subsidies. You might have a central bank that bails out an insolvent banking system. Those are examples when actions that are not typically considered to be part of the economy because they don't seem to be part of how the market normally functions, suddenly become central to how the economy operates. People talk about it, politicians talk about it, technical officials talk about it as well. And so my argument here is to kind of think about how by presenting these interventions as temporary, as emergency interventions, there are certain consequences that are useful for us as economic sociologists to think about. So a brief roadmap. I'll try and get through all of this. I'm going to start a little bit with Michel Calon and his work on externalities and framings and overflowings, moving to Polanyi's work on fictitious commodities, labor, land, and money, and how they make the problem of government involvement central to how the economy operates. And then I'm going to take a strange detour with, sort of a now very controversial figure, and I can talk a little bit about that too, Giorgio Agamben and his state of exception. And then I'm going to try and give some, a little bit of a kind of a sense of how this kind of framework may apply to the history of the spread of Keynesianism in the sort of in the post-Second World War period as a kind of globally dominant way of intervening in the economy. And I'm going to talk of it in terms of economic exceptions. I'll try and get through all of this. Why start with Calon? When Michel Calon, writes The Laws of the Markets, I think back in the late 80s, he concentrates on the problem of market externality, a problem that obviously gets from economics, but adopts in a very original way and makes it more sociological. He defines externality as something that's external to how a commercial transaction is defined and kind of managed. Because the people who may be affected by the externality have no voice in terms of responding to it. And so maybe they don't even notice it. And that sort of means that the benefits of market exchange are not the same as the negative consequences that emerge from it, because you have different parties that are differentially exposed to market activities and the outcomes of those market activities. So when market fails, to Calon is an important way of kind of approaching the problem of market constitution as well, because there is a sort of an economic influence mainstream way of thinking about the problem of market failure, which is all about contracts. So if something goes wrong, like that's the picture of like the classic market externality of the factory that pollutes the river. So you can make that pollution illegal and kind of create legal documents that instead of thinking of pollution as an externality, makes it central to how the market operates. And so it's priced, and we're going to hear actually more about that later in the symposium, I think. This is reductive to Calon because the externality to him is not just a matter of who bears the cost of something that they have no control over regulating. It's also about a relationship between a transaction and a broader environment. And it's a relationship between that exchange or that process and economic knowledge more broadly. So it's not just about what happens in the market, but it's also the framings that get applied to market activities that are important to defining what an externality is. And so Calon proposes two famous terms here. The concept of framing, which is the set of processes that allow parties to a transaction that affects them without there being some sort of opportunity for them to control how that exchange plays out for them, in terms of processes that allow for the identification, containment, and measurement of how markets operate. And then to him, the overflows are what happens outside of these framings. And so whenever we take into account the interdependency between a market transaction and the larger environment, whatever it is that the framing does not capture, Calon calls it an overflow. And to him, that's important because that sort of like sets up a problem where the identification and then the intervention that ameliorates the externality becomes a matter of creating a system that can measure those effects. And so that's why he uses the term metrology there. A way of identifying overflows so that once you can calculate what their magnitude and type actually are about, then you can make them the subject of negotiation or conflict. So first you measure and then you fight, I suppose, if you want to put it like that. And this sort of becomes, a larger kind of project where, Calon and then sort of in work with, other people like, Koray Shalishan, for instance, sort of becomes a way of thinking about the economy as a whole. So framing and overflows become a way of thinking about how to create the economy means to call something economic. And that's a way, it's an effect of applying a particular cultural framing that by defining the economy as economic, then allows it to be managed through economic representations and devices. And those devices, where do they come from? A body of knowledge that we also recognize as economic, that is professional and lay economic theory. So that's sort of how I think this kind of performativity program brings it all together. And, the relationship between economization and externality goes through the making of, that sort of like, kind of what Calon became famous and controversial for, the idea of like the calculative agent. So you have a moment where, you need to equip people with the ability to calculate. And once they do that, those actors then are able to prove that they are experiencing overflows and externalities. They can establish who's responsible for them, or at least have the capacity to initiate to engage in that sort of debate. And then, like the moment that they produce incontrovertible measurements to a framework that sticks, that is robust, they can use it as a way to calculate their own interests. Now, it sounds very kind of very rationalistic, and in a way that's kind of the point here. I mean, I think Calon kind of had this phrase like Homo economicus really exists, and that's how he gets there. To me, this is interesting, but sort of bringing it back to a more sort of traditional sociology that Calon himself has been very critical of. So people like Karl Polanyi sort of like is a way of thinking about how the economy is constituted that runs into a problem or a challenge. And the challenge that I have here is like not the challenge of embeddedness, which is sort of what economic sociology has become sort of like has built an identity around, but rather the problem of the fictitious commodities. So not so much the degree to which markets are, of society, in society, or outside society, but rather the problem what's distinctive about markets and whether there are issues. There are exchanges and commodities within markets themselves that need a particular kind of framing that the sociology of Calon needs to be reinterpreted before it can get there. The notion of the fictitious commodities that come from Polanyi is the idea that there are certain aspects of the economy, certain elements, and you know, Polanyi famously talks about money, land, and labor, that are always, they're acting as commodities, but they're not. They can never be fully disembedded because they always require state regulation and intervention. If you want to have, you know, labor, you need to think about what happens when workers get sick, or, you know, when they have children, or, you know, when they get old, right? I mean, so you have to sort of start thinking about life. And when you think about life, this is not something that the market necessarily is open to managing in the same way that the government can. So the moment that you start introducing the problem of fictitious commodities, the issue of framings and externalities become a little bit more complicated than Calon would have it. Calon would respond this way. There are some situations that he calls cold, where essentially there is no controversy, and so it's just a matter of getting the government to adjudicate between competing interests. You're polluting the river, and so, you know, the people who live downstream call their elected officials and get the plant to either stop the pollution or to compensate them for the pollution that the plant is creating. Calon distinguishes those situations from hot situations where the government itself is a party in a broader conflict, and where, you know, metrology, or, like, you know, kind of technological technoscience, scientific knowledge plays a more central role, where essentially before people can fight over the details of what they want, they need to define the parameters within which they're going to have their conflict and negotiations. And here the question that I pose is whether in hot situations where essentially everything is up for grabs, that people are fighting not just about whether something is right or wrong, but whether the measurements of what's right and wrong are themselves a stake in the conflict, whether technoscience, economic knowledge is enough to give stability to the sorts of exchanges and interactions and relationships. So in a way, what Calon ends up doing is having a theory where the government is relevant in cold situations because it can help people drop the right contracts, and then if it's an effective government, it can be called upon to enforce them. But when a political authority has to identify and manage an overflow, it runs itself into the problem that it can itself start constituting an overflow. So you have legitimacy issues, right? So the government may intervene, but the government intervention into a market in exchange that is creating externality can itself become an externality that people push back against and mobilize against and criticize. So how is it that the government manages its own intervention when what it's trying to do is to stabilize a market with its own problems to begin with? To me, that's sort of the entry point for a kind of different framework and a different language. And so I want to sort of use the kind of the concept of critical events, and something that, you know, Andre has been working on as well, to sort of think about moments where government intervention is not just happening behind the scenes through, you know, the drawing up of contracts or through the work of lawyers to kind of get people to interact with markets in a more kind of sustainable way, but rather when government intervention is least visible, where it has to operate to stabilize market, but at the same time has to intervene in a obvious way, and that obvious intervention becomes a problem that the government itself has to negotiate, and if it doesn't, it has to pay the cost for it. So here I'm throwing up a very simple definition from Sewell about critical events as kind of moments where sort of the work of the state becomes visible because people recognize that what's happening is extraordinary, is notable. There is a sort of awareness that what's going on is not routine and it's different than regular normal times, so to speak. So I'm not sure if Agamben can come to our rescue, but back then I thought he could. The story here, Agamben is famous for sort of his political philosophy of the state of exception, and it's a theory that it sort of develops with the philosophy of sovereignty, and it's a theory about how, you know, the sovereign becomes a sovereign the moment that they make a decision, and that decision is exceptional. And so moments of emergency and exception are precisely moments where routines and norms and the legal order itself are suspended. But then there's a promise that they're going to be reinstitutionalized once the emergency is over, except that to Agamben, that exception is never over. The exception itself becomes the norm, and it actually reveals something broader about the way that rules and regulations and the laws itself always work. So that in a way that's a simple way of kind of thinking about Agamben's advancement here on people like Carl Schmitt. The exception is constitutive of the norm. It's not just something that happens when the sovereign has to make decisions. If we put Agamben in a conversation with the problems that I've been talking about so far, it seems to me that there's potentially a simple way of kind of getting these two frameworks together. So when the government has to intervene in a critical event, in a crisis, it can exploit the critical event and frame what it does as if it was to restore the status quo, even when it may transform it. And so the government, starts paying people money directly, but it does it with the idea that that's how you restore the market economy down the line. And then, once the emergency is over, is a question of the government's authority itself, whether that intervention will or will not continue. But the government can also structure the intervention explicitly as a short-term one, therefore not worrying itself about externalities at all, in the sense of not having to engage in a process of framing or thinking about the overflows of market exchanges, but simply ignoring the long terms and focusing on what needs to be done now. I mean, so I'm Italian, and Mario Draghi is sort of famous for whatever it takes, right? The subtle language of no matter what it takes, we'll do it because this is an emergency that we're not going to exploit. We're just going to use it as a way to then return to normality once the emergency is over. To me, that's a useful, at the same time, problematic way of putting Agamben in a conversation with this literature. Partly for reasons that have to do with Agamben's own position in during the COVID crisis. Again, something that we can talk about if you're interested. What I think is useful from an economic sociology perspective is to make a distinction between the sort of stuff that Agamben talks about. You sort of heard my language. It's all about, the government decides, intervenes. It's a very, it's a way of, giving a lot of power to the government, as if its role is essentially one of acting whenever needed, and then, the government has to worry with those consequences only later. That's useful, but at the same time, it's a limited way of kind of thinking about how the government operates. What I want to introduce here is the possibility that the sovereign exceptions that Agamben talks about are not quite the same as the economic exceptions that are implied, that they're involved, or they become operational when markets fail. Now, there is actually sort of a strange and kind of esoteric literature on economic exceptions that Agamben himself has worked a bit on, and then kind of a tradition of scholars who call themselves economic theologians have developed in a very interesting way. And it's sort of it's a way of thinking about economic exceptions through actually the history of the church, of Christianity. And so kind of thinking of it in terms, but not of Christianity as a religion, but Christianity as a set of religious organizational processes. And so sort of the story here is that, we can kind of think about economic exceptions not just as a way of the sovereign asserting their authority, but also as a way of expanding a community, especially a community like Christianity that for a very long time has been regulated by God-given laws, so canon law. In this perspective, economic exception is more about essentially being flexible with administration by suspending the law, and in the process renegotiating the relationship within the community and the leaders of that community, with the idea that that relationship may change over time. So the difference here is that Agamben is very top-down and sort of focused on the dictatorial potential of the sovereign exception. In this theory of the economic exception, the language is one of community. I mean, the religious language may be off-putting, but the idea here is that we're dealing with processes by which a community expands, even in the context of, sort of the need to be accountable to, very kind of strongly normative legal systems. And so the economic exception is about suspending the law in this strategic fashion to allow for an expansion of society. Now, these are economic theologians in the sense that they argue that ultimately what underlies this process is the market society in which we now live in a great part of the world. And so sort of the kind of community that these scholars talk about is a community of exchange. And that community of exchange is really like, may expand or contract, but it has to do it in the context of a very flexible relationship to market rules. An economic exception, I think it's a framework that we can develop. I'm not sure if I can do it like satisfactorily, but we can develop to think about these dynamics. So that's sort of like my kind of, kind of simple-minded synthesis here. You may have a political state of exception on the economy when the intervention of political power identifies and manages the externality and cools it off. So you may nationalize a strategic industry, the electrical industry, or or you may nationalize petrol. You may militarize the economy. You may set up a free trade zone where kind of national laws do not operate. To me, these are sort of like examples that I think do a good job of capturing kind of a political exception to how the economy operates. The sort of like, the rules are changing in a way that there's an implicit promise that they may revert back to something like a market economy, but the changes themselves are very significant and potentially durable. When we deal with an economic state of exception, we need to kind of be attentive to a dynamic that, to me, is a bit different than this sort of this sort of relationship between government and the economy. And it has more to do with a set of justifications and a set of practices that are really targeting the expansion of markets rather than the relationship between political authority and market authority. And so in the long run, an economic exception may all be about getting markets to go. But in the short term, it's really about negotiating how markets operate. And so here have as examples, a central bank bailing out a banking sector, so giving free money to financial and banking elites with the idea that that's how you restart the credit market. Or even stimulus spending during a recession. So countries where you have automatic stabilizers that kick in when the economy is in trouble, you sort of think about those sort of interventions as having to do with the restoration of kind of functioning markets. They may imply a different relationship with the authority, but they're really about kind of thinking about the contour, the boundaries of the economy itself. There's all sorts of kind of things that we can say about it, but maybe since I have 5 more minutes, I'm going to skip the slide. So let me talk a tiny bit about the rise of kind of Keynesianism as a way to help us think through some of these abstract frameworks. So there's obviously a lot of work on kind of the rise of Keynesian thinking. It tends to be kind of focused on the U.S. and Western Europe, and sort of like the this is probably all very familiar to you, scholars who focus on ideas, institutions, the professional dynamics of economists and their connection to political parties, and then sort of like, people are more influenced by performativity. They focus on economic devices themselves, models, specific ways of calculating the economy. But I think like sort of the big story here is that we need to pay attention to these long social processes if you want to understand why Keynes's ideas at a certain time in history, depending on the context in which you are. It may be in the 1930s, it may be in the post-Second World War period, but at some point in history they become very prominent ideas that have important influence on policy. In a way, we can tell this story from a point of view of continuity. And so, scholars who pay attention to, how Keynesian economic theory and policy recommendations develop, what they discover is that there isn't really major differences between the economics before Keynes and economics after Keynes. Yes, there is a different relationship with state administrators and the role of economists in the state apparatus changes, but at the level of how economic knowledge gets produced, it's a story about synthesis. And the reason that we think about the history of economics in terms of a Keynesian moment and then sort of a neoliberal moment or sort of a neoclassical moment is precisely because those labels are used by economists themselves as a way of staking out their ground in the economics profession. But in this sort of approach that looks at continuity, the idea is that if you pay attention to the methods and devices that economists use to do economics, those methods and devices tend to they have a longer lifespan than economic theories themselves. And so Keynes, for instance, was very much against a kind of a blind reliance on economic models to think about the economy. Economists do not really pay attention to that Keynes lesson of Keynes, and even economists who will call themselves neo-Keynesian, when they look at the economy, they tend to think of it in terms of something that you can model through very well established by now sets of statistics. So it's a sort of continuity here if you approach it from the point of view of how economic knowledge develops. Now, of course, scholars were a bit more attentive to the relationship between economic theory and economic practice. They tell this story in terms of ruptures, so critical events, right? So this is a quote from Mark Blythe, who's sort of kind of a very important figure in this story, where his idea is that economic ideas are not always kind of transformative, but they're really important in moments where institutions break down, right? So when you have the overflows that can no longer be managed, that's when economic ideas pave a path to the future. And you can tell the story of the rise of Keynesianism in this fashion as a response to specific crises, be it the 1929 depression in the United States, where the Keynesian state sort of really starts to get going, or kind of the problem of kind of restoring the global order after the Second World War, where again Keynesian ideas become very powerful as a reaction to this crisis. So my take here would be that if you approach this story from the point of view of economic exceptions, that becomes a way of paying more attention to cultural and moral mechanisms that enable the continuity in the in the economics profession, but at the same time do so through changes to the relationship between economics and politics that is very selective and pragmatic. And so here the sort of a possible research agenda will look at how it's not that Keynesianism gets adopted. It's certain Keynesian frameworks that are, and others are not. And the ones that are, they are framed and justified as exceptional rather than as enduring elements of how you should run a market economy. So I don't know, you can't read this, but the most famous sort of Keynesian element is deficit spending. So the idea that that there is a role for economic stimulation and stabilization that can be played by the government. Now, if you look at the details of how deficit spending gets introduced into various national economic kind of policy-making trajectories, it's as a neutral technique that's not really about, kind of thinking about, unemployment or the problem of poverty or the problem of development. It's really about specifying a technical relationship between the government and the economy that lends itself to being economized. And I think it's very easy to contrast something like this to aspects that, for instance, in the United States, in the 1930s, the government was very much involved in economic planning. Public works, the organization of industries, and those economic planning activities in the context of the Great Depression were themselves framed as pragmatic responses to emergency, and yet they did not stick around. There's actually an interesting debate about whether, kind of with Biden, there's a return to economic planning, so this is sort of an interesting kind of aspect to pay attention to. But the idea here is that, that's part of, kind of the Keynesian package that emerges and then goes away. And I mean, even most kind of glaringly, public employment policies that even in the United States sort of get debated in the 1970s, and they're very supported for a period until they sort of succumb to disillusion and discontent. And so, when deficit spending remains, but other elements of the Keynesian framework disappear. So, let me conclude here. I think that the main thesis that I'm proposing here is that we can think about the economy-society separation as something that gets drawn and redrawn by exception. It can enhance the sovereignty and the power of the state. It can give a lot of power to governments and kind of state officials, but that's not the only pathway possible. I think to me that's sort of an important point to make. Especially in a time where kind of Agamben's like theory of the state of exception sort of gets used as a way to essentially condemn any sort of government intervention in the economy as essentially being about a strengthening of its own power. So that's sort of one I think kind of potential conclusion here. The second kind of conclusion is more a set of questions that if you find it useful to think about economic exceptions as particular ways that the government uses to intervene in the economy with a certain set of kind of goals and processes attached to them, we can start asking all sorts of interesting comparative questions. Do different institutional arrangements lead to different types of economic exceptions? Is it useful to rely on, sort of variety of capitalism type differences and intersect them with, how economic exceptions operate to enrich that typology and potentially expand it beyond the kind of specific national experiences that framework emerges out of? Do economic exceptions have their own history? And so do they have their own patterns that, sort of stabilize across institutional contexts and so have a sort of path dependency to them? And how do they intersect with the relationship between a country's own relationship with global capital? What kind of opportunities open up to governments in the use of economic exceptions may be something that a focus on national history or kind of national experiences may be too narrow to kind of fully capture. So those are sort of more provocations than kind of very precise questions, but I hope that this was useful, and I sort of look forward to your questions.
This is interesting, and I'm posing this in the spirit of exploration because it's just kind of like getting me thinking. From the way that I understand how you're using the concept of an economic exception, it suggests that there's this idea of a relative steady state or kind of like secular path for the economy, and then there's some kind of intervention that's exogenous that produces the moment of exception, and then the kinds of possibilities for variation that you describe in your last slide are all responses to the moment of exception. But then when you refer to development pathways, and another way that has been used to think about development is developmental project. So most recently, one way that's been developed that certainly I've heard policymakers in Brazil talking about very recently is drawing from Mariana Mazzucato's mission-oriented way of thinking about state intervention in the economy. So it seems like there are at least two different ways of thinking about justifications for state intervention in the economy. One is the exception, and the other is the project, or the mission. Am I right in kind of like characterizing this exception logic as one that's an exogenous intervention in an otherwise secular path that's heading in a kind of like predetermined direction? Or is this an approach that could apply to this more kind of project-oriented or mission-oriented justification for state intervention?
it's a wonderful question. Like, this is giving me a lot to think about, actually. So, I think, like, you're right that sort of the reemergence of kind of a discourse about the interventionist state, right? And so, interesting, like, the sort of, like, we go from the entrepreneurial state to, like, really the kind of new kind of planning projects, right? Even though I'm not sure if the term planning is as central as it could be. It sort of poses a problem to the story there. I think you're right. That's a challenge for my argument, in the sense that I'm sort of operating with the idea that, well, you have an economy that is being run by authorities that are really invested in keeping the fiction alive, that this is a market economy, but the government is not doing anything visible. And then the moment that a problem happens, and like you can't, you may actually. The fiction is I'm polite enough to sort of say, like, the fiction is a fiction, in the sense that the government always has to be involved in the economy, right? But the moment that the involvement becomes visible and kind of contestable, then, like, the exception is a way of negotiating that potential conflict, right? But you're right, though, like, if the sort of if I remove that assumption and I say, like, no, I mean, we're really dealing with, like, a context where the maintenance of the market fiction is not something that the economic authorities are even invested, and they're not even that's not what they're doing, right? I mean, and so then is the language of exception completely irrelevant in that context? So I need to think about that a little bit more, because, like, it's challenging. Like, my sort of, like, kind of reaction here would be to say, well, you still have to think about how the project relates to global market forces that themselves are very invested in maintaining at least an understanding that, well, you may be doing, like, kind of sort of, you may have a developmental approach to how you grow the economy, but in a global world, you have to abide by rules that are market rules. And so it may be that it's a question of level of analysis, in the sense that the exception then becomes, something that needs to be negotiated. It's not so much a kind of government-society relationship, if society is the kind of national society, but it is sort of a government-international relationship that needs to be. So maybe that would be maybe my kind of quick answer to that. The accountability to global capital is what makes this language a bit more complex than the way that I'm presenting it, but still useful to think about context where kind of maintaining the fiction of the market economy it's just not something that there's a lot of investment in, right? So that's sort of a strategy. You can even make a quip that, in a way, like, I mean, even the so-called kind of market liberal economies, they're really, from the sort of international point of view, they're the most kind of likely to violate whatever rules they impose on other countries the moment that, it doesn't work with their own projects, right? And so then you can think about the language of exception itself as having maybe like a more complex set of elements than the ones I'm presenting here. But I think it's still sort of useful to kind of introduce it there. But yeah, I'm not doing justice to your question, so thank you for asking that.
Questions on Zoom?
I'll meet you in the way to discover if I understand your ideas. It's possible to think that the distinction between economic and political exception is a political problem. It's not a theoretical. In the public debate, the parties involved in the public discussion, the definition of the state politics, etc., they are discussing if this situation is an economic exception or political exception. In your frame, you're thinking this, incorporate this distinction not only in the point of view theoretical frame, it's also of ethnography, sociology, problem to discover how the people are defining deception, political or economy. This is the first question. Can I do other questions for the same price? For
Yeah, this was easy. So
yeah, it is easy. No, if when you were thinking this frame, you found a historical exceptional situation that wasn't so easy to say this is economic or this is political. Which are the situation that is not so easy to define, because this is also to show us more about your ideas and methodologies.
Thank you. Yeah, also sort of very thought-provoking. I think you're right that what I'm trying to do here is sort of like kind of think about scholars who really insist on the importance of framing processes to sort of how markets get constructed, and so I want to be sort of like truthful to that approach, or like kind of respectful of that approach, and say that I think you're absolutely right that the question of whether an exception is political or economic cannot be predetermined. I mean, it has to emerge from the very state-society interaction that the exception is supposed to intervene in. So I think you're right that maybe like it's not the right way to kind of think of it in terms of something that can be solved theoretically, but it's something that has to emerge from a kind of an ethnographic engagement with how these framings get sort of like put together and then kind of circulated. So I think like that's very very useful. I think like what's also important is that there is an asymmetry there, right? I mean in your case it really backfired, right? I mean, so the Argentinian state really wanted to sort of intervene and then sort of say, oh, and then like you have to thank me for it, and so I don't want to exaggerate the power that the state might have in negotiating the exceptions. At the same time, like to the extent that the state as an institutional framework made up of central banks and ministries of finance and all sorts of kind of positions that sort of like are very they're very powerful in terms of sustaining certain kinds of framings and often introduce asymmetries in the kinds of responses that society can then propose in opposition to those framings. I think that it's useful to sort of like to remain attentive to the influence that political authorities themselves may have in the setting of in the formation of particular framings as opposed to others. So it's not really a yes or no kind of answer, I guess, right? I mean, and so but the ethnography would have to be kind of as much of a political ethnography, right? I mean but I think you would agree with that. Now, kind of like Ben's point, right? I mean, so am I really like, am I working with an idea that like this is sort of like, this is the economy that's sort of working, and then, and so like the relationship with politics is just not problematic, and then something bad happens, and suddenly, that relationship gets revealed. And so what is this sort of like, blissful moment where, the economy is not political? I think that's another important challenge to what I'm saying here. But what I'm trying to draw here from is from like kind of people who argue that this sense that the economy, it's kind of like, working of, thanks to its own kind of dynamism and even its own laws, like, I mean, if you want to think of it like that, it's partly a question of, kind of representations, but it's also a question of the kind of concrete methods, devices, and technical relationships that make the economy appear to be what it is, right? And so in that sense, I think we can perhaps distinguish moments where that technical infrastructure is just simply invisible, and moments where that infrastructure gets revealed as being always been political, but in a way that it cannot be, once you pull the curtain out, you can't just kind of draw it back and return to a situation where sort of the previous framing is accepted in an incontrovertible, like, kind of at face value. Yeah, that's the right term that I was looking for. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that when you may have, in a way, like, kind of very like the kind of examples that I'm gonna come up with are pretty simple. So maybe you can help me with that. But the language of the 1% in the United States, or even like kind of the language of like kind of inflation as kind of corporate greed. To me, like they emerge out of experiences where there is a heightened awareness of the sort of the political and technical infrastructure that makes the economy work, in a way that once it's revealed, something has to change for that infrastructure to return to being visible. So I think that's sort of, so it's not really an economy kind of politics boundary. It's really like an economy kind of technical knowledge that lends itself to a certain politics. I guess that, I'm not sure if that's super helpful, but that's the way I'm thinking about it. And that too, like maybe like the debt is with is to the kind of performativity approach that has really insisted that things like even something as simple as a price gets constituted through multiple processes that then suddenly get abstracted away, and then you have a universal price for a commodity. But just behind the surface, that all these processes that they're very easy to forget because they're too complicated, they're too they really happen behind the scene, and people focus on the price. But the moment that the price breaks down, then those underlying processes themselves become visible, and then they need to be rearranged in some way for them to work. But, thank you.
We have a question from Michelle. Sorry? Oh, yeah. I need to use the microphone.
Okay.
Are
you going to read? You have the question on chat?
From the
hybrid possibilities.
Chat on Zoom. If there is a historical pattern that imposes certain political institutional conditions for the economic exception to occur in capitalist societies, how does a process like globalization affect this pattern? Globalization intensifies the phenomenon of economic exception to the extent that it transforms the role of the nation-state as intervener in the productive structures in its territory.
No, thank you. This is some continuity to previous questions, so I appreciate you pushing me, and I don't know if I can't see on Zoom, but thank you. So I think you're right that the idea that the state has more to do in the economy than simply sort of keeping the rules straight and kind of punishing those who violate them is an important component of the kind of global capitalist society in which we live. I mean, even like kind of the sort of world polity kind of perspective in sociology, like always has made this I think like insightful argument about how the state loses some power over globalization, but establishes itself as like a very important unit of analysis, right? I mean, and so as an organization, the state is just sort of like it gets reconfigured by globalization processes. But to me, that's sort of like why then kind of an attention to kind of exceptional interventions become particularly important, because if you accept that kind of globalization may mean a more like homogeneous set of rules about how an economy should be run, then kind of to make those rules work in local context is always going to require not just reinterpretation, but moments where the rules are not applied. Other rules are applied. No rules at all may be applied, and what you may have is other sort of arrangements of like kind of practices at play. And so to me that in a way like justifies this kind of framework of exceptions even more, precisely because if you want to put it this way, like the exception is what gives more flexibility to governments who may be under a lot of pressure to engage in the proper kind of intervention, and if they don't, to sort of show results for what they do, right? I mean, you can kind of think about exception as a way of sort of like creating a sort of buffer between what we expect of politics and what politics deliver, sort of inhabiting this kind of more ambiguous zone that, on the one hand, could be used as a way to pursue very different courses of action without having to recognize that that's what you're doing, which can have all sorts of important kind of potential opportunities. It can open up all sorts of new doors. But at the same time, like, sort of kind of makes the problem of accountability and transparency even more difficult than it currently is. In a way, like, if you... So I do research on sort of central banks, and like, and in central banking, the idea that you have to have transparent, like, kind of policies on how you govern the banking sector, and how you think about credit and money supply and so on and so forth. This sort of like discourse about transparency has become really dominant over the past 20 years or so. So much so that we can all kind of access the minutes of very powerful central bankers on public websites, right? But to me, in a way, that's an interesting way of thinking about how that doesn't really mean that the economy has become more democratic, because we can all see what happens, right? I mean, and so then how do we make sense of this sort of this juncture, this gap, and kind of like thinking about what happens as an exception may be a way of sort of investigating that gap with a different framework, and so. It may be that actually under globalization, like, kind of exceptions become even more important than they would be in a more sort of nationally oriented world. But I'm really speculating. So
I want to follow up on the previous questions, actually, but especially Ariel's question. And it's basically two provocations. The first one is I was thinking about the way you see critical events as also politically motivated. So sometimes it might be the case that to enact an exception is it's a way of keeping of making things remaining the same, as Lampedusa said. So in the first provocation is it Sewell's conception really the best way of understanding events here? Because exceptions are not necessarily structural transformations, right? And I think that it seems to me that you were working with a different vision, conception of events. The second provocation is about economization, because in the end I was wondering if it's still a good foundation for what you are arguing. It seems that it's always limited, but I also, to be frank, I was thinking a lot about your work on central banks and how central bank authorities are always invoking how politics gets into the ways and prevents them of doing good economic or monetary policies. So aren't you showing that economization is not enough, perhaps as a way of doing of showing how the economy is enacted and how it relates to the state?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, in a way, it's sort of like I'm gesturing towards critical events, but I'm sort of like kind of exploring how they may lead to structural transformations that are not notably recognized as such. So that's not Sewell. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, that's really more about how it's about exploring the kinds of options that governments may have when they're facing something that kind of various actors are calling a crisis. They may lead to a restructuring of the relationship between economy, society, or economy and politics, but they do it in a way that denies like the transformative nature of what they're doing. So I think you're right that there is like it's the terrain between kind of the critical event and the structural transformation that this paper is exploring. So thank you for that. On the economization point of view, though, to me, like, you know, the reason why I find this interesting and useful to this project is because it sort of like gets us to think about, you know, something that people like central bankers don't really take for granted. Like, I mean, but they don't really dwell upon when they're talking to the press or like to the public, which is that, you know, they sort of like inhabit this kind of contradictory role in the sense that, you know, if the economy was really like you know, kind of its own kind of, you know, domain that's insulated from other domains, you don't really need a central bank to do anything more than, you know, essentially enforce the law. But central banks do a lot more than that. And this is also not to discount the importance of enforcing the law. I mean, you know, there's actually like good historical work on how that's sort of how central banks came out. Like, they came out of attempts to essentially mop up, you know, financial crises in a moment where, you know, you had, you know, kind of banking actors acting in ways that were not just illegitimate but straight out illegal, right? I mean, so sort of like banking supervision is a really important kind of function of central banks that sometimes like it's not quite as, we don't pay attention to it as much as we do to, like, you know, kind of monetary policy or the more sort of like, you know, spectacle-like things that central bankers do. But what's sort of interesting is that I think economization kind of gives us a set of insights to think about how an institution like a central bank may be able to do what they do without calling it a political intervention, right? And in a way, you know, the central bank too, maybe like we need more kind of, there's a lot of like performativity work on central banks, but maybe we need to do a bit more institutional work as well, because it's a sort of like, I think we tend to think of it as like a strange institution that's like half private, half public, and then depending on like the legislation, it could actually just be private and with public functions, or it could be a, you know, it could be a national institution. So there's lots of variation in central banks. But perhaps that variation is precisely what we should, and that ambiguity, the sort of straddling between the private and the public, is precisely what we should be putting at the very center of how we think about institutions. And I think that sort of the economization approach has sort of good tools to think about that, precisely because, well, it looks at, you know, representations, but it looks at representations that are backed by day-to-day practices that, because they're technical, they tend to be, it's not that they're not politicized, but you have to approach them with technical knowledge in the sense that, you know, say you want to influence interest rates, you need to know how to do it operationally, right? I mean, and so I think that's where economization is important, and also sort of like the economic exception helps us to kind of think about how it fits with what we know about, you know, the management of economies from a more kind of political point of view, right? And yeah, so that's sort of.
I was just thinking the questions you had. One of them, could you go back to?
Oh yeah.
Or no, anyway,
Sorry,
one of them was about the varieties of capitalism and the state of
Yes,
exception.
yes.
And I think that's an excellent idea. But I was wondering if a even clearer sort of distinction would be capitalist state of exceptions and, for example, socialist state of exceptions. So I'm thinking about Poland after 1989.
Yes.
The new government comes in and says this is a state of exception where we will redraw the boundaries and we will create a free market economy. So I'm wondering whether it would be not an interesting idea sort of to look even more extreme cases where you have on the one hand capitalist and non-capitalist economies and state of exceptions in those.
I think so. I mean, I think like, I think that's, to me, it sounds like a terrific, like, kind of research agenda. Like, I mean, it's kind of interesting because, like, I started thinking about these concepts when doing work on the Italian central bank, and the problem that Italy has in the post-war period is how to join the EU, right? I mean, it's sort of like, and it's an issue in the sense that you have to go from like kind of like kind of a capitalist economy that was very mixed, though, a huge kind of role of the state, not just in terms of the fictitious commodity sort of stuff, but ownership of critical sectors, to the kind of economy that fits in the EU context where you can't have that sort of thing. So in a way, like I guess like my answer there is that like I think you're right that kind of the variation like lends itself to many more kind of nuanced comparisons than sort of like this is what happens here and that's what happens there. And I think like kind of drawing out the similarities and kind of differences between different kind of economic systems, like kind of capitalism, socialism, would really enrich this. So thank you.
So thanks. So throughout the presentation, and I guess this question or this comment will reflect my own training, I was thinking about these ideas in light of Neil Fligstein's theory of market transformations. Ben already sort of alluded to this sort of, kind of punctuated equilibrium kind of model that undergirds a lot of this. But what I was thinking is that you actually, part of the strength of what you're doing here is that it actually helps solve some sort of unresolved issues or sort of just so aspects of the Fligstein account of market transformation, where states do intervene in these punctuated ways, in these hot sort of manner in critical moments. But from that perspective, it's very Polanyian, right? Like it sort of highlights the myth of the separation of state and economy. And yet, I think part of a key point you're making is that, well, that myth has to be maintained in a certain sense, even while it's being violated. And I think that's one way to think about a contribution of this. I don't know not that you need to reframe it around that, but I think if you're imagining this as contributing to a new handbook of economic sociology, I think that's one way to think about this pushing forward some of our sort of more canonical ideas of market transformation.
Yeah, that's very generous of you. Thank you. That's. And
I confess there wasn't really a question.
No, but I mean the question is, so why not do that, right? I mean, like, and I think that's
think of that?
yeah, that's right. No, I think that's you're right. You picked on kind of like the kind of the underlying kind of assumption about how you're like in this kind of stable field world, and then you have the shocks, and then how do you deal with that? So and I think like from that perspective, I think you're right. Like that's something I need to think about a little bit more, in the sense that to me what's kind of interesting or kind of useful from this sort of like kind of perspective is that if we take like a very kind of Bourdieusian kind of view of the state, like as sort of like the kind of symbolic power, or like kind of meta capital, like kind of the this sort of like kind of essentially enforcing the rules of the game, right? It becomes a little difficult to understand the enormous amount of work that the state often does to deny its own power, right? I mean, and so. And in a way, like, that's also why kind of Agamben is useful, but not so useful, because to Agamben, that's sort of like, but ultimately the state has power, because, it can just, can call the cops, or like, the army, and then, it sort of boils down to that. You create, the state of exception is ultimately sort of a, kind of a slide towards like a dictatorial society, right? And Agamben is very spatial. You have, kind of all these zones that you set up these kind of exceptions, you really institutionalize them. But like, if you look at this from kind of the point of view of like kind of the economic role of the state, I think it does open up the problem of how of why the state has to do the work of kind of denying its own intervention, even when it does it, and on top of that, when it regularly does involve itself in the running of the economy. So I think that's very useful kind of cross pollination. So yeah.
Thank you, Simone. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll have a 10-minute break. An announcement in Portuguese because it's for the Brazilian audience. Because this is probably a lot more abstract than Simone's presentation, a lot more theoretical, and I'm not very used to do this, but I decided to give it a try, so to speak, and to think exactly about what can the study of crisis do for economic sociology. Probably the youth won't get the Monty Python reference here, but some will. And I will try to show how crisis can help. Well, crisis cannot help, but the study of crisis can help to show economic sociology new paths. At the same time, this presentation is a little bit nostalgic because I will be talking about, it's in the subtitle, very old theories and why I think they could help economic sociology these days. So, in our times, crises are pretty much everywhere. That is, everywhere there are numerous communities enacting crises and denouncing wrongs, just like Mafalda here. This might reflect, as Kozelek recognized, a distinctive modern attitude towards critique and collective interventions. Some of these wrongs undoubtedly present real existential threats, yet the enactment of crises, as in climate crisis, necessitates the constitution and stabilization of these wrongs by means of crisis narratives, by means of observations that produce meaning, like as Reutemann argues. One could argue that crises require framing wrongs as crises, but these narratives go beyond that. They create their own objects and contexts. Sociology has been a fundamental part of such observations and crisis enactments. It possesses a wealth of knowledge to offer and has undeniably made valuable and urgent contributions. However, the primary emphasis of these contributions has often been on producing a sociology of errors. It involves pointing out a substantive or epistemological error, a historical difference, a mismatch between appearance and reality, leading to a post hoc denunciation with an intervention in view. This approach meticulously examines causes, culprits, and makes an indictment that manipulates critical knowledge to partake in the enactment of a crisis. Again, Reutemann's work, Anti-Crisis, discusses important limitations to the sociology of errors, which are mainly blind spotting the conditions of production of knowledge leading to the enactment of a crisis, but also crucial questions about how the relevance and significance of certain aspects of reality are defined as critical, and how the denounced error is revealed. Despite blind spotting the conditions that give relevance to critical indictments, crisis narratives perform throughout the state and what they silence. They make people act and feel. Yet sociology equally gave limited attention in its crisis narratives to the pragmatic and phenomenological aspects of crisis enactments. That is, what these enactments make humans do and make humans feel in particular ways that relate to the singular trajectories of collectives and subjects of crisis. Therefore, such narratives or enactments persist as a fundamental object of study within sociology. They also offer great potential to the advance of the field of economic sociology. this is especially true if we adopt a second-order observation approach to the sociology of crisis, which involves examining the process of how these enactments are made and succeed and what they produce. In this communication, my aim is to assert that by redirecting our focus toward the pragmatics and phenomenological experience of crisis, we uncover fresh possibilities and explore paths within the domain of economic sociology. Specifically, I believe that adopting a second-order observation of crisis enactments, focusing on the pragmatic and phenomenological aspects of crisis, can contribute to offering economic sociology a better theory of first understanding and knowledge practices that underlie the enactment of economic facts, and particularly, of course, crisis, specific economic enactments. But a theory of understanding and knowledge practices that takes into account the affective affordances in the pragmatics of economies, or the role of emotions in the ways people experience and make sense of economic objects. And also takes into account the eventful dynamic of economies and economic lives, or the role of events in economic enactments. I probably won't have time to talk about this third element. We can discuss this. We have been discussing this, and Simone already pointed out some of much better than I could some elements of this eventual dynamic. To make this a little less abstract, I illustrate these potential gains with some anecdotal evidence from the research I've been conducting on the various enactments of crisis in Brazil, either as a sequence of crises or as the tragic decade, as the Minister of Finance declared 2 weeks ago in an interview, referring to a period of protracted crisis. The very constitution of the object is contested as part of a politics of events that gives rise to multiple enactments. These enactments reflect how people understand their experiences, memory, and their sense of timing of events. Since this is a second-order observation, shall not define what this crisis is, but work with the definitions of their members. Oh, yeah, sorry. This is what I just said. Well, starting with the problem of understanding. Revisiting this question of understanding may initially appear arcane after the attack of social and technology studies against cognition and knowledge. The STS criticism targets a representational conception of cognition and a constructivist view of knowledge that consider that social contexts could alone explain the content of knowledge. To my best knowledge, I think it's John Lowell who formulates the strongest critique against this notion of cognition, suggesting that no boundaries exist between cognition and materiality, content, and context. This critique is fair and can be retained, of course, yet by replacing the idea of knowledge as the revelation of pre-existing reality with a conception of knowledge practices that produce reality, the significance of understanding these practices and sense-making remains crucial. Simply erasing these boundaries would only circumvent the underlying issue. Even if we reject any epistemological advantage to humans and the pre-existence of entities and context, while acknowledging the role of materiality and the production of actors within networks, it remains essential for emergent actors to make sense in order to translate and partake in the enactment of facts. The applications of actor network theory to economic phenomena display these and other limitations, distancing from earlier STS work that, I would argue, provide firmer ground. I'm thinking, of course, the work of Calón and Muniesa, and Calón, Milo, and Muniesa. This ANT-inspired economic sociology provides a theoretical framework to the problem of understanding in the form of performativity. Within the performativity framework, agents or actants emerge in hybrid networks or assemblages co-producing objects and their meanings. These agents resemble cyborgs, always well attached to devices reproducing models that have become ingrained in the infrastructure of financial markets. Reversing important assumptions of earlier ANT work about translations, Calón's own work about translations, performativity assumes that models act and enactments correspond to the intentions of theoreticians and engineers of markets. Moreover, performativity omits personal convictions, interests, prejudices, and political leanings that exert a significant influence on how individuals produce economic facts and material devices in which they become embodied. They shape the trust in these devices and expectations of outcomes. Their importance to the successful enactment and survival of theories and models that have become ingrained in the infrastructures of markets in face of disavowing tests has been established even for financial markets by Mackenzie and Milo. Acknowledging the role these elements play in the translation and enactment of economic facts, practices, and institutions does not diminish the significance of material elements in social technical arrangements. So we don't have to get away with these elements to understand the making of markets and the enactment of economies and social technical arrangements. The performativity approach also fails to consider how ordinary citizens actively contribute to the enactment of the economy through their everyday practices. The importance of common sense, vernacular, everyday knowledge practices cannot be underestimated in shaping the understanding and enactment of facts. This significance is supported, again, by earlier studies in actor network theory and the subsequent development of the new sociology of expertise, also inspired by ANT. This becomes particularly relevant in comprehending economic facts such as inflation. Consumers have their unique ways of making sense of inflation and acting on inflation. And without the cooperation of these consumers, even the most stringent monetary policies aimed at addressing the issue may prove totally ineffective. The earlier Calonian sociology of translation recognized the proliferation of accounts that arise from the process of translation, misunderstandings, and misfires, treating them symmetrically. Furthermore, it emphasized in hybrid networks the negotiations of experts with various publics to make themselves indispensable to enlist and enroll members of the public. It gave space to these ordinary, everyday, vernacular forms of knowledge. The new sociology of expertise, and I'm thinking here on basically the work by Eyal and Anne-Marie Moll, in turns highlights how enactments of facts in specialized realms like biomedicine require communication and cooperation among interested publics and patients. This analysis emphasized the need to expand the scope of analysis beyond specific professional jurisdictions defined by academic credentials, and instead encompass a network that includes various actors involved in problem definition, devices, instruments, concepts, and institutional and spatial arrangements. Furthermore, this literature underscores that knowledge practices should be viewed as claims on action rather than claims on reality. Another economic sociologist who has done work that in my opinion, provides firmer foundations to tackle the problem of understanding is, of course, Viviana Zellizer's work showing the diversity of meanings humans produce in their economic lives. She has also shown how meanings that humans bestow to economic transactions and objects are entangled with relations that either motivate or generated by transactions. So meanings ascribed from the relations in which the transactions are inserted. But I believe that economic sociology can go one step further or back, I don't know, to also understand how humans make sense of the situations in which they act, which relations are at stake, and how they evaluate relations in practical circumstances. In general, what I think is missing in these approaches is the intersubjective historicity of understanding memory and oblivion. Despite the precarious nature of entities emphasized by ANT, humans, who are constantly becoming entities in assemblages, carry a past that does not completely fade or reset with each new enactment of facts. At new events in which the facts have to be asserted to act, humans may resort to their lived experiences and the resemblances they retain in their memories. So, I believe, in this sense, that phenomenology, old, good phenomenology, can help. And the contributions of phenomenology are manifold, but for the purpose of this discussion, I will focus on two key aspects and demonstrate their relevance in comprehending crisis enactments. I will present some evidence from expert debates to illustrate this argument. And I have chosen to focus here on expert debates about crisis because it might be less apparent that the understanding of experts is also influenced by common sense and life world experiences. The two key aspects I want to focus on. The first one is the role of common sense and ideal types, which were central to Schutz's phenomenological work. To quote Schutz, the common sense knowledge of everyday life is the unquestioned but always questionable background within which inquiry starts and within which alone it can be carried out. So humans naturally, in the sense of a natural attitude, rely on practical concepts, ideal types that they develop through their experiences and that become part of their life world. This material serves as a foundation for conceiving their practices and the economic facts in general. Common sense is also an important part of the stock of knowledge, expression developed by Schutz, that experts employ and that pre-organize their enactments of economic facts. Building upon Husserl's ideas, Schutz highlights that it is from the common sense concepts of the life world that all scientific and even logical concepts originate. Economics possess a stock of knowledge that encompasses various commonsensical concepts that shape its enactments of realities. And crisis serves as a unique vantage point for recognizing the significance of common sense ideal types in understanding economic facts. When a crisis is enacted as an exceptional and unprecedented event, it offers an opportunity to witness individuals questioning the unquestioned background that they typically accept without scrutiny, thereby testing their common sense assumptions. It can prompt individuals to temporarily set aside, put in brackets, practical concepts they typically deem valid in light of their experiences. But this needs not to be the case. In cases where crises are enacted as routine or continuous, and Latin America has a lot of examples, they generate a distinct stock of knowledge that humans draw upon when in new events they experience and enact as similarly critical. For instance, during the recent COVID-19 crisis, monetary authorities worldwide conceived the rapid increase in consumer prices as a problem necessitating interventions to control demand. They tested an ideal type notion of demand-driven inflation enacted by raising interest rates. Despite evidence indicating a possibly different enactment, that is, an imbalance of on the supply side, their models of practice and material devices are based on assumptions derived from past experiences of demand-driven inflation. These models primarily aim to confirm this common sense and address factors related to demand. When the consumer price index began to decline recently in Brazil, the president of the central bank, Roberto Campos Neto, made a public statement attributing the decrease to the central bank's understanding that it was necessary to swiftly and proactively raise interest rates. The stock of vernacular knowledge humans acquire in their trajectories of past crises is equally an important resource for making sense of the conditions of action. The second element that I think can be helpful to develop a better theory of understanding in economic sociology is the notion, also the Schutzian notion, of different systems of relevance. Schutzian phenomenology posits that reality is divided into zones of varying relevance for different individuals. So phenomena receive different levels of attention by humans based on their system of relevance. This perspective emphasizes the importance of experience in influencing economic enactments and possible lines of action, and suggests paying attention to personal and collective trajectories. Even if we assume the reality is not subject to infinite frames of reference, as Schutz suggests, but rather practical achievement through enactments, we can still retain this idea. All enactments involve a process of selecting which entities are deemed relevant, which are accepted as granted beyond question, and which constitute objects of further inquiry. By the way, it's quite interesting that the young Calonne, so to speak, also identifies these three zones in the process of problematization within scientific practice. By examining the debate within the epistemic community surrounding crisis enactments in Brazil, specifically on articles published in Valor Econômico from 2014 to 2021, featuring the terms economic crisis in Brazil or economic recession in Brazil, we can observe how the elements that are singled out as significant and problematized as entities requiring intervention evolve over time. The relevant entities that were enacted in the economic recession of 2014-2017 were very different from the ones deemed relevant during the COVID-19 pandemic. In ways, they're very different from the Argentinian case described by Ariel. So, what I want to do here is to look at both the frequencies of words and the main topics of this corpus of 13,000 articles using LDA topic modeling, starting with the exactly with the frequencies, and I didn't translate the words, but I will explain them. We'll see that fiscal, inflation, debt, and adjustment are heavily concentrated on the 2014-2017 period. 45 to 64% of the currencies of terms like inflation, debt, fiscal, and adjustment often appears in strong association with fiscal, are found in articles published between 2014 and the second quarter of 2017. Only 11 to 28% of the currents of those same terms are found in articles from the 2020 and 2021 period. I didn't want to add another table, but the pandemic gives relevance to terms like employment, like income, and of course like pandemic and disease. Moving to the to the topics, and I'm sorry for this not very helpful visualization I'm using here, but I will explain. These are the 12 most salient topics in the 2014-2017 period. And they highlight the critical aspects singled out in the debate and central to the crisis enactments. Instead of going through the 12 topics, the optimal number of topics, I would just say that what are the most common salient terms in this topic. So interest rates appears in 10 topics. Investment appears in 8 topics. Inflation appears in 6 topics. Debt appears in 5 topics. And political risk appears in 3. Government officers like president, government, the executive, minister also show up prominently in this period. When we move, I think this visualization is a bit better, but not. Yeah, I know. It's not the best. When we move to the 2020-2021 period, these are the 7 most salient topics. We can go through why 12 and 7, but technical stuff I don't want to waste my time on. They highlight very different critical aspects. So I don't want to do a strict comparison, but highlight differences, right? Here, government appears only in 3 topics. President and minister occur in 1 topic only. And it's one topic, that is topic number 3, devoted to describe government and legislative negotiations. One topic, topic number 5, is entirely devoted to describe the global dimension of a crisis, which is completely absent from the previous period. And we see in topic number 7 an increased concern for the social effects of crisis that didn't appear in the 2014-2017 period. So the Brazilian case is completely different from the Argentinian case. Let me say. So moving to the I'm wrapping up, and I just want to show that these phenomenological aspects also call for the recognition of the importance of emotions in the understanding of economic enactments. And despite numerous calls in sociology, including Nina's call to reassess and emphasize the impact of emotions on economic life, its significance continues to be primarily explored within the realm of work practices, including care. Emotions, along with materiality and common sense knowledge, constitute an integral part of cognitive processes and significantly influence the enactment of economic facts. So by investigating the pragmatics of crisis enactments, we can shed light on the effective affordances of crisis, what crisis may emotionally produce. This includes examining how different emotions influence the way humans conceive and act on crisis, which attempts at problematization are accepted and which ones are rejected. So to get away from a very Cartesian divide between reason and emotions. Crisis has often been closely associated with critique, but empirical research shows that there are very diverse affective affordances of crisis. And to illustrate this, we can explore some of the observed affordances in recent crisis experiences in Brazil. Now I want to turn not to the experts, but to the common people, the subjects of crisis. There are many emotions that are being invoked by crisis, and I just want to list a few to finish my presentation. This is based in an ongoing field work I've been conducting with these guys over there. So they have been helping me to produce these findings as well. In Heliópolis, the largest favela, my time is over, I know. The largest favela in São Paulo. And basically, what I will be sharing here is the result of conversations we have had in the past year with local associations, large local associations in Heliópolis. So the first feeling we get talking to them is a feeling of abandonment and neglect by the state during the pandemic, both in terms of assistance and in terms of a lack of knowledge about the local realities to subsidize policies. So the largest local association in Heliópolis, UNAS, turned into a data-producing organization, and many other local associations across Brazil started producing epidemiological data about COVID-19 to deal with the lack of knowledge. A second effective affordance involved the category of essential worker, a legal category that would establish who should stay at home, basically, and who should go to work. And what is interesting is this category is both criticized by essential and non-essential workers. Those who were categorized by essential workers and those who were categorized as non-essential workers. Non-essential workers feel deprived of income, the opportunities, and feel condemned to remain in crowded houses. And essential workers feel they and their relatives were exposed to extreme risk. Now, 2020 and 2021 was a period of very heightened political conflict in Brazil, or polarization, if you want, and you find these criticisms both in the right and in the left. Both sides would agree with the criticisms. There was also a short-lived surge in altruism, so humanitarian feelings were part of or one of the effective affordances of the recent crisis. And many associations, including these local associations in Heliópolis, turned to the distribution of food and meals. But this surge was very short-lived, and they had to create a whole infrastructure that suddenly, in 2021, became redundant and had to deal with that as well. There's also the moral embarrassment of needing help. We had a meeting with a team of this large local association in Heliópolis, UNAS, who is conducting research, native research in Heliópolis. And a member of the team strongly advised us against asking people about the sources of help or whether they received help. And the member had a very, very interesting discourse about the moral nature of that involved in receiving help. And finally, of course, there was the feeling and the bodily feeling of hunger and frustration for not being able to socialize over food. I want to end actually advertising the last perspective edited by Martin here, and to point out the excellent article written by Federico Neiburg, who explores in depth the element of hunger and the bodily aspects of inflation and crisis. So that's it. Thank you very much. And sorry for using my prerogative as organizer to extend a little bit my time.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I want to ask two questions, actually. The first one, I think it's a little bit out of place, but I would like to ask you to elaborate more on what do you mean with phenomenological sociology, because, of course, I'm personally very interested in the ways that social science is influenced by and dialogues with philosophy. And phenomenology, of course, is a very specialized field of philosophy even today in contemporary philosophy, and the way knowledge is produced by these people and by sociologists is very distinct. So what I want to know is, when you are talking about phenomenological sociology, do you think you are in an interdisciplinary endeavor, dialoguing with philosophy, or do you think you are departing from an already well-established sociological theoretical tradition, coming from Schutz, for example? And the second question is, because you showed us the results of topic modeling and these very novel research techniques that combine qualitative and quantitative aspects, and if you think your theoretical framework, thinking for instance about phenomenology and going back to Schutz, is well aligned with the techniques you are deploying to in your research and in your projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I guess I answer those two questions. I'm not a philosopher, so I wouldn't feel comfortable doing phenomenology as a philosophy. And I think that Schutz did a great work of translating these ideas to some extent, translating these ideas into a sociological project. I also agree, I didn't have time to go through this during the presentation, but I also agree with Patrick Aspertz, who also developed or advocated the use of phenomenology in the understanding of, specifically in his case, markets, that there's a lack of empirical guidelines in Schutz's work, and Aspert's work tries to help with some guidelines to conduct a more empirical phenomenological sociology. But besides Asper's work that focus mostly on professionals, I think that we can perfectly do a sociology recognizing the importance of personal and collective trajectories and how these trajectories affect, influence the ways people understand and act to produce economic enactments and produce realities. Of course, I mean, if we take, for example, the question of inflation, and again, the last issue of perspective also does a great work showing that people have very different experiences of inflation, and it's especially interesting if we contrast this with a rather narrow expert knowledge, monetary economics knowledge on inflation. Now, your second question, of course, I mean, I use the topic modeling as a way of talking about the debate of experts or the epistemic community. But I don't think it's far-fetched. I don't think it's too distant from Schutz's own work, especially thinking about the way he... Someone needs to be muted, sorry, but I don't know who. Is it? Okay. Sorry. Especially his work on newspapers, right? I mean, I'm not recreating the wheel here. The Well-Informed Citizen, one of his most famous papers, discusses exactly newspapers and news, which back then were basically to be read on newspapers. So I think it's completely, I might be wrong, of course, but I don't see any sort of contradiction to the phenomenological project. But of course, it's not enough to understand these embodiments in lived experiences of economic experiences.
He paid the bills on Sociology of Money. No, first I love this idea or this project to incorporate more broadly the phenomenological ideas to the economic sociology. I think I was thinking when I heard you that when we work with Mariana with the dollar and the history and how our concern was how the US dollar became part of the ordinary knowledge of the people, not experts, of the people in the Argentine. So we didn't develop this connection between phenomenology and economic sociology, but now we read you, we can incorporate it. In this sense, I have some question. First, the phenomenological project is present in economic sociology, the tradition of the economic sociology, through Pierre Bourdieu. So, what do you have to say about that, especially about the economic habitus concept, because it's how Bourdieu incorporated the phenomenology in the analysis of economic practices. The second, I was thinking in other concept, maybe that's you already thinking from Schultz, that maybe it's important to think about crisis. First is the durée, because this concept help us to think about the temporality of the experience in general and in the temporality of the very specific experience that as the crisis. And it's different how the subjectivity temporality against the objectivity temporality of the crisis. Maybe this is something important for you or not, I don't know. And the second is this concept, the multiple province of meaning. It's also important to put in the table in this conversation, because I think that, as you said recently, the crises have different meaning from different peoples. Yeah. Just that. I was remember my reading about Schultz. So
thank you. These are a lot of questions, but given that we're running a bit late, maybe we should collect, and I will try to deal with them.
Thank you very much. First of all, for your presentation, it's very interesting. I have two questions. One, it's mostly methodological. I would like you to elaborate a bit more, if you can, on how to study emotions, because knowledge, it's apparently easier because you can capture knowledge from discourse, mostly from written discourse, so it's easier. So what happens with emotions? It's just a matter of changing the set of keywords, or there's something else, and I am very interested in what you have to tell us about this experience, mostly this qualitative research experience. And the other question is, well, it's quite methodological also, but it's mostly from our Latin American experience, and that has to do with the very idea of crisis, how to study crisis when people tend to perceive crisis as routine. You had some cartoons and vignettes there in your presentation where, well, what crisis you are talking about, because we have many crises. Everything is crisis. So, and all the time we are experiencing some kind of crisis. So how to set the boundaries for that. Thank you.
Thank you. I will try my best. Those are wonderful questions, actually. It's like, thank you very much, Ariel and Mariana. So I can start with the question of well, first of all, Ariel, thank you for reminding me of the idea of multiple provinces of meaning, which is quite interesting. And I think that this project of connecting phenomenology with embodiments or emotional aspects brings us back to William James' work, which is the basis for Schutz's discussion there. So it makes a lot of sense. I have one of my main questions at this point is whether people engage in crisis enactment, in a specific crisis enactment, share an understanding or simply have completely different understandings. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. It seems to me, but I still, it's not the result. It's a hypothesis that what people do is normally to translate these enactments in multiple ways, but they are not completely different meanings. Then there's durée and the temporality. The third point I didn't present was all about durée and temporality. And why I think it's more interesting is that it's not only super important to understand the subjective temporalities of the subjects of crisis, but also how experts deal with crisis. In Brazil, there has been an ongoing debate for the past 20 years about when our crises start, right? I mean, for some economists, it's the 1980s, and we have been in a long, stagnant economic situation since the 1980s due to the exhaustion of the fiscal capacity of the state or demographic shifts. For some people, I mean, again, experts, I'm talking about experts, economists, this is linked to external factors, to other internal factors that change the scope, the temporal scope of crisis. I used this recent, the recent talk by, or interview by our minister, and my colleague, by the way, he used to teach here, who used this idea of tragic decade. So it's not COVID, it's not the economic recession, is the tragic decade. And before that, we had the lost decade in the 1980s. So this is a very important element. And in terms of the subjects, there's an I think that studying crisis gives a very interesting way of approaching events, because crises can be multi-scalar events. And it's not just that they are subjectively experienced, but when you interview people, they will probably talk about COVID, about family situations, about personal situations, about disease, about unemployment, about their dogs and cats, and I mean, so they're multi-scalar events, and that organize how they experience those broader events. Sometimes if personal events or familiar events are more important to them than even national or international events. And finally, there is Bourdieu. Yeah, the elephant in the room. It's a great question, because I have been working on this for a while, and then last week I wrote a friend that said, maybe I did all this work and I ended up with Bourdieu. And why? Why? Right? But I really think that I mean I might be wrong again, but I think that this common sense is not the same than habitus, in the sense that you don't need a specific, right, framed economic habitus. I keep thinking about the earlier Bourdieu's work on Algeria and the unemployed, and I mean, here we see, especially in Latin America and Brazil, that people, they are not, let's say, unfit to deal with economic emergencies or crises. On the contrary, Brazilians seem PhD in dealing with inflation, right? They laugh at what, like, people are talking nowadays in the global north about inflation. So, oh, you're complaining about 10%, right? So, I mean, they don't lack, right, something like an habitus. And then, Mariana, the second question about crisis as routine is also about how to deal with events, right? Events don't need to be, we were discussing this during Simone's presentation, doesn't need to be this punctuated trajectory. They might become routinized. And then it's interesting to see how, as I said, crises in these situations develop their own stock of knowledge that people might or might not mobilize. And it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, a lot of sociologists over here have been studying trajectories of people. It makes a lot of sense, because depending on the generation or cohort or specific trajectories of people, you find different stocks of knowledge and different expectations about economic enactments. Just to give an example, to make this less abstract, again, with inflation, the youth in Brazil are not so used to inflation as we are. And for us, like 5%, 10%, that's nothing, right? I mean, we know how to deal with that, especially if you have a bank account, of course. But it also affects how people see this crisis enactments as exceptional or a continuation of a long stagnation. Again, I mean, when we interview the youth in Brazil, they are much more critical to the economic situation, because for them, especially due to the social mobility in the 2000s, they think that, oh, my world is collapsing. When you interview people that have, let's say, 40 or 50 years, it's completely different, right? And how to study emotions, right? I guess that, well, people, I think it's the same. I mean, the recent interviews you conducted during the pandemic, probably you saw the same. People cry and during their interviews, so it's not that. I mean, it should be difficult, but it's not that difficult. And of course, I mean, I would say the optimal way would is conduct ethnographical research, right? Because you see people in action and you see people dealing with their feelings in several ways. One more. Okay, he's the boss now. No, you're the boss now.
So I wanted to ask you a question that I'm struggling with. When you talk about stock of knowledge, you talk about both what individuals think and what they feel, and you talk about newspaper articles. So something that can also be called collective representations, very public. Does it make sense to include both categories in one, or is it? Wouldn't it be better to distinguish the individual stock of knowledge from collective representations of, like, the cartoons? And I don't have a good answer to this. Maybe it's not, but just wanted to ask what you think about it.
Yeah, it's again. Thank you for it's a great question, and it faces something I've been struggling with. That is, I'm trying to approach both experts or expert understanding and ordinary vernacular understandings of economy in a symmetrical way. So that's why I'm trying to say there's stock of knowledge everywhere, but I'm not. I have to be fair. I'm not totally convinced. I think that if for sure that we can. When we do with the newspapers, we can approach the epistemic community as a community that, like, they are the competent members with their own stock of knowledge, right? And they mobilize these categories all the time. So I'm pretty sure it works for expert knowledge and the debates on newspapers in general. But I also tend to think that people develop their own sort of stock of knowledge that is not necessarily collective in the sense of collective representations, not as wild as wide as collective representations, because they rely on specific trajectories, individual and collective. We are conducting research in a very specific area of the city, which has its specific history of struggles, for rights, and that, I mean, it's not like Brazil has a collective representation about this. So, but I'll have to think more about your question. Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, on Zoom and in the room. We'll continue tomorrow at 9, same room. So have some rest and see you tomorrow.